And go.
Okay. So last week, Dorothy talked a little bit about citizen-led civic tech, and I thought I'd actually follow up with that with sort of a bit more of a, I would call it historical perspective. I call it the ongoing history. And part of it was actually spurred on by actually Amanda's project. She had talked a little bit about doing a legislation tracker for the Ontario legislature, which I thought was actually kind of interesting because they were talking about scraping Hansard, which is the official sort of transcript, right, of all parliamentary debates in the House. And what's interesting is actually Hansard by itself actually has a bit of a civic tech history. And that got me digging into other things, looking around sort of like, old forms of civic tech and sort of where that stuff comes from. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples tonight of some of that. And I guess the point really is just to sort of, just to say that I guess like civic tech has been around since the dawn of society and civilization. People have always been trying to hack things, I think. And sometimes the results haven't always been great, but I think the point is that there's always this idea that citizens are at the forefront of this. And a lot of these changes actually come about because people actually stood up and said we want to do something about this. Well, my first example actually is Hansard. So of course this is Parliament's transcripts. And originated actually in the United Kingdom. In Parliament there, but the thing is actually before 1771, parliamentary debates were actually kept a secret. No one was allowed to actually report on them. The Parliament actually released results of votes, and they would say what general action we took on a particular item, but it was considered to be members' privilege to actually be able to say whatever they want in the House and not have it recorded. Which of course sounds totally bizarre to us today, but in those days this was actually real. In fact, if you tried to publish proceedings of the House, you could have been charged, fined, or imprisoned. So, I mean, taking you back now to the early 1700s, what a lot of newspapermen started doing, so journalists, publishers, right, is they started actually hiring people to go into Parliament, sit in the gallery, take copious notes, come back out, summarize it, write it up, put it in the newspaper, publish it so that that information became accessible. But of course all of that was just really a summary, it wasn't verbatim. Some things may have been misreported, some things may not have been reported accurately. So there's a lot of this sort of back and forth that happened, and so that also gave rise to the ability for you to be charged, potentially imprisoned for doing these sorts of things. So it wasn't actually until the 1800s when there's a gentleman here, the gentleman in the middle, William Corbett, actually started publishing this thing called the Weekly Political Register, which was his attempt at gathering all of the different summaries that had been published in all the newspapers at the time, and starting to collect them together and publish these longer sort of summaries in his own publications. He actually later sold that to the gentleman on the right. His name is Thomas Hansard, who Hansard's names come from, who continued to publish it throughout the 1800s. And it became sort of a bit more of an authority because Thomas was actually able to start, he actually went to the legislators and said, look, we're going to publish these anyways, so if you want to be a part of this, I can sort of let you see it before I publish it, so we can strike out all the information that may not be accurate or, you don't want really being said, right? But the idea is that people still want this, and of course, actually after 1771, it had already been allowed by Parliament, so this was something that they started doing. So people started realizing the value of this, and by 1878, Parliament actually gave a subsidy to Hansard's company to continue to publish these documents, the Hansards as they were known, and to this day it's still obviously a government-sponsored thing. It's part of Parliament. It's a very vital part of our democracy to be able to know what our legislators are talking about, and it's an accountability piece. And even here in Canada, up until actually 1880, there was no answer for the Parliament. At the time of Confederation, there was actually strong resistance from folks in the Family Compact against it. And it was actually like publishers like William Lyon Mackenzie, who led the Upper Canada Rebellion in 1837. He was part of that sort of movement to try and, again, hack at this essentially, publish these documents in his newspaper so that people could actually read about it and actually understand what was going on in their own Parliament. So it's just a sort of again, like a very historical example, but again, using technology, right? Printing press, newspaper, being able to talk about what your elected officials are saying. Another interesting sort of hack are these things, public libraries. So they have a very interesting story. So this actually is a picture of the circulating library in Scarborough in 1818. This is Scarborough, England, of course. The idea of like subscription-based circulating libraries actually originated in the mid-1700s in Britain. And in those days, books were very expensive, and so the idea of paying a small fee to a private library to be able to access the collection seemed very reasonable. The interesting thing was some of these libraries were actually owned by publishing houses, so it was their way of sort of getting people to look at their books, to be able to read these books. In the early days, there actually were some libraries that were open to all, but there was also a large number of libraries that were these gentlemen's only libraries that were only open to men. The interesting thing was that by the Victorian era, novels had become very popular, but they were generally frowned upon. In fact, a lot of people, like one of the things that I read about that was cited was how we probably shouldn't make these libraries so openly available because people are just reading this smut in these novels, and it's really just corrupting society. So the self-serve. Another interesting thing is that a lot of these libraries were they were sort of closed libraries in the sense of closed stacks. So in order to access the books, it's not like the libraries we have today where you walk in and you pick a book off the shelf. You had to actually go up to the librarian and say, I want this book, and they'll get it from the back for you and give it to you, loan it to you for a certain period of time. The invention of the self-serve library actually didn't exist until 1910. It was pioneered actually in Pittsburgh. The United Kingdom actually started to fund free public libraries about the 1850s or so. They passed an act called the Museum Act. And in that act, they contained money for museums as well as libraries. And again, the idea at the time was that, this is one of the reasons why at the time was that, this would actually help people not go around and do so much drinking. They could actually go to libraries and learning something, so maybe we should actually fund these things. In North America, subscription libraries existed as well. Philanthropy actually established most of the first sort of what they call free libraries at the time, free public libraries, and much of this actually was driven by Andrew Carnegie, the famous guy who ran the steel factory in Pittsburgh. He actually built over 2,500, he funded through his foundation over 2,500 libraries around the world, and that actually greatly increased the whole concept of free libraries. And he had this deal. He would go to a municipality and he would tell them, I'll give you money to build a library, provided you can stock it with books and you can continue to maintain a budget to operate it over a certain number of years. And so that's actually what started a lot of the free libraries, and that's what started sort of public funding of libraries in municipalities across North America. And so, again, the point of bringing this up is that public libraries, as they existed, were sort of, again, a bit of a sort of civic technology in that way. People really just got together and said, why don't we actually make books more available because they're too expensive for people to buy otherwise? Just use this sort of methodology to do that. And then just talking briefly a little bit about Toronto. So Toronto's public libraries actually started out as mechanics institutes. That's the building on the left there. The original one actually was at Church in Adelaide, which is now a gigantic condo. This was actually a subscription-based library as well. The mechanics institutes were these technical and adult education centers, I guess sort of similar to a college sort of today. It wasn't actually until the 1880s when there was an alderman named John Hallam. There's a street actually named after him in the West End near Ossington. He suggested the idea of creating free libraries because this was a movement that's happening around the world and we really should start really getting on that. Not surprisingly, he faced opposition from Toronto City Council. In fact, he had to pass a referendum to actually get the first library funded, which existed in this building. And in 1883, it opened inside this building as the first public library in Toronto. The one on the right actually is the Central Library. Does anyone actually recognize that building?
It's the U of T bookstore now.
Exactly, yeah. So this was actually our Central Library, which was built in 1909, which is now the U of T bookstore. This is one of 10 Carnegie libraries. So Carnegie gave money to Toronto to build 10 of them. Well, this is one of the Carnegie libraries in Toronto that's no longer in use. There's 7 actually currently that are still standing. Riverdale, Runnymede, Yorkville, any of the older libraries that look kind of fancy, those are the Carnegie libraries. The Toronto Public Library today is, of course, the world's busiest urban library system. 32 million circulation through 100 branches, so it's a pretty awesome civic tech, I would say, something from a long, long time ago. And so I also wanted to bring that up because we see another library sort of popping up these days, right? The tool library. And this is, again, a really cool civic tech. I mean, does everyone know what the tool library is? Be able to rent tools. And I'm reminded actually of an earlier sort of private enterprise. I remember these things called like Stevens rental centers that used to exist in Toronto. Basically, you went in, you paid a fee, you get tools by the hour or by the day, right? And it was meant to be for profit, and they had branches all over the city. You could just go and pick it up. This is sort of the nonprofit version of it. And sort of the really interesting thing to me is that we're now seeing this actually partnering with the public library. And it actually has a space, for example, at Downsview Public Library, where there is a tool library housed inside a library branch. So is it the case that maybe this will receive public funding in the future and turn into its own sort of civic technology that's part of that, sort of similar to libraries in the past, or answered in the past? Something worth thinking about. And of course, throughout Toronto, we have tons of citizen leadership in many projects. Does everyone know these projects, or has heard of some of these projects? Friends of the Pan Am Path, Southgate Foundation, James Walk, Better Budget TO, Park People. If you do, you're just as nerdy as I am, which is awesome.
What's Stopgap?
Stopgap builds ramps. So there's a gentleman named Luke Anderson, I believe, and he's in a wheelchair. And he just basically got sick and tired of going to restaurants and being like, I can't access your restaurant because there's this stupid step here. And most of them really are just like one step, right? So he started a thing called the Southgate Foundation, and what they do is they source free donations from home hardware, and they build ramps, wooden ramps, which they paint in multiple different cool colors, and they'll put it outside your restaurant for free. Nice. You just have to request it. Yeah. Is everyone else aware of all these little projects? So I guess what I'm saying is the citizen leadership on a lot of these projects is sort of leading the way forward. These are all very successful projects, all of which have been either funded through government or have raised money on their own, or have found a way to start to fund themselves. James Walk is going down that path right now. So there's multiple different sort of like strategies and concepts around it, but I guess the point is that this is what is leading, I would say, a lot of this sort of citizen-led kind of civic technology. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be in digital-based technology. There's a lot of really great initiatives around it here too. And we're doing awesome. So just a general sort of parting thoughts here that I guess sort of gathering from a lot of these examples. Citizens have been at the forefront of civic tech throughout, I think, history. So the question really then becomes, should they all be government funded? Then there's another question that's raised. I mean, we all go to the library. We kind of take it for granted, right? And I mean, a lot of times there's like these fights that happened. They were controversial. Like with cancer, people got arrested. With the libraries, they had to pass a referendum, right? Like, just trying to be able to remember, I guess, some of where this comes from. I think is kind of cool. And also just to understand that we shouldn't necessarily take these things for granted. Always be aware of that piece. There's a huge social justice and sort of community resilience piece that is built through all of this. With a lot of the examples that I've shown, I think the key sort of theme has been access, being able to provide access to those without the means to do it, which is a social justice challenge. But also like the idea of building up that community resilience through citizen leadership, I think is really cool. I mean, you often see a lot of this in communities where there aren't a lot of resources. So, for example, places like Detroit, where we do see things like bartering networks and alternative currencies are popping up there, and that's another sort of interesting sort of piece around how do you build community cohesion and resilience. And ultimately, I think a lot of civic tech is challenging that status quo, even if it means doing things that are controversial or may get you in trouble. But you know what? That's the only thing I think that's really ever changed a lot of things. So anyway, that's just my thoughts on that. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share. I'm happy to have a discussion about some of these things.
Nice.